The woodcutting committee came on a Wednesday. This was the second Wednesday of November, which was the Wednesday that the Beaver Dam settlement had designated for the annual winter preparedness survey since 1844, when the first winter without a preparedness survey had produced 2 families who arrived at February with inadequate wood supplies and had required community assistance at the cost of 3 cords from the common reserve, and considerable ill-feeling about the management of personal responsibility versus collective obligation, a discussion that the settlement had resolved by agreeing that a November survey was less costly than a February crisis. The committee that conducted the survey was 3 men: Halvard Viken, who was the settlement's oldest Norwegian settler, and who conducted the survey with the authority of someone who had survived 11 Wisconsin winters and had therefore earned the right to look at other people's woodpiles with a professional eye; his son-in-law, Petter Strand, who was 30 and strong and who carried the ledger and wrote the numbers; and Lars Husum, who was there because he was on the committee and because Olvard trusted his judgment in the specific matter of identifying wood that looked adequate from the road but was not adequate from close range. They came to the Sanvic cabin at the end of the day's survey, which was the last stop on the Western Circuit, because they had been saving it. They had been saving it because the Sanvic cabin was the stop they were least certain about, and uncertainty at the end of a long day was easier to manage than uncertainty at the beginning, when the mind was fresh and inclined to find problems rather than assess them. Britta Sanvic had been alone on the claim since her husband Einar's death in March, 8 months, and the settlement had been watching her situation with the particular attention it gave to widows in their first year alone, which was attention that combined genuine concern with the occasional assumption that the concern would be necessary. They came around the road bend that put the Sanvic claim in view, and all 3 of them looked at the south wall of the cabin. There was no wood pile. Not a small wood pile, not a partially depleted wood pile that explained itself as a supply in progress. No wood pile at all. The south wall of the Sanvic cabin had no wood against it, no lean-to roof sheltering stacked cordwood, no rounds waiting to be split, no brush or slash indicating recent cutting activity. Halvard looked at the south wall. He looked at Petter. He looked at Lars. Lars said, "East wall." They looked at the east wall. No wood. Petter walked to the north side and came back and said, "North wall, no wood." They stood on the road and looked at a cabin that had no firewood visible anywhere on its exterior, and the temperature outside was 21 degrees, and it was the second Wednesday of November, and there were approximately 5 months of Wisconsin winter remaining. Halvard said, "We should knock." He knocked on the south wall because the south wall was where he was standing, and because the door was there, the standard Norwegian frontier door on the protected face, and when Britta Sanvic opened it, she was wearing a work dress, and her hair was neat, and she was not the picture of a woman in the early stages of a winter emergency. She said, "Halvard, come in." They came in. The cabin was 54 degrees, which was warmer than the outside and warmer than the temperature of a cabin that had been heated cautiously because the wood supply was uncertain. The stove in the corner was burning with the particular economy of a fire that was being managed by someone who was not worried about the supply. Halvard said, "Britta, we came for the November survey." She said, "I know you did." He said, "We did not see any wood outside." She said, "No." He said, "We looked at all 4 walls." She said, "Yes." He said, "Where is your wood?" She said, "It is here." He looked around the cabin. He did not see wood. She said, "Come." She went to the corner of the cabin behind the east wall and moved the braided rag rug that covered a section of the floor and lifted a hatch. The hatch was larger than a floor hatch had any right to be, 3 feet wide and 4 feet long, hinged on one side, fitted with a rope pull on the other. Below it was the beginning of a passage, a tunnel that descended from the cabin floor at a gradual angle into the darkness below. The walls of the tunnel packed earth faced with flat limestone, the floor of the tunnel cut stone. She lit the lantern she kept on the hook beside the hatch and went down. They followed. The tunnel descended 12 feet at a gentle slope, and then leveled out and widened from the narrow passage into a chamber. The chamber was 8 feet wide and 20 feet deep, its ceiling the underside of the hillside behind the cabin, its floor packed limestone gravel, its walls earth and stone. Along both walls, from floor to ceiling, firewood was stacked in tight alternating rows, the split faces pale and uniform in the lantern light. It was a lot of wood. Halvard stood at the entrance to the chamber and held the lantern up and looked at the stacked walls and began calculating. He was a practical man, and he calculated wood volume the way farmers calculated it, by the dimensions of the stack and the rough density of the species. And the number he arrived at was the number that stopped his calculating because it seemed too high. He said, "How much is here?" She said, 14 cords, approximately. "I have not measured it precisely. The summer cutting was good." He said, 14 cords. She said, "I cut in July and August with the cross-cut saw and the splitting maul, and I hauled it to the entrance and stacked it through August and September. By October it was all in." Petter Strand, who was behind Halvard with his ledger open, wrote 14 cords in the Sanvic entry and looked at what he had written and looked at Britta. He said, "A woman alone cut 14 cords. She said, I cut 12 cords by myself. My son Niels came in August for 2 weeks, and he cut the last 2 cords with me, 14 total. Halvard picked up a piece of oak from the nearest stack and held it in both hands, the gesture of an experienced woodsman checking what the hands could tell him about moisture and density. He turned the piece over and pressed his thumbnail into the split face and examined the result. He said, "This is dry." She said, "The chamber holds 52 degrees year-round. It has the same draft principle as a cave system. The air moves from the deeper parts toward the entrance because of the temperature differential between the deep ground and the surface. I have a ventilation gap at the back of the chamber and a gap at the top of the tunnel entrance. The air circulates. The wood dried from August through October and has been maintaining its condition since." Lars Husum, who had been at the back of the group listening, said, "You planned this in July." She said, "I planned this in April when Einar died, and I understood what the following winter would require and what I was capable of providing." He said, "You built this tunnel and this chamber alone." She said, "I built it from April through June, while there was still spring frost in the ground, to guide where the permafrost was and where it was not, and before the summer heat made the excavation laborious. The structural work took 9 weeks. I completed the ventilation connections in early July and stacked the first wood on July 8th. Halvard was still turning the oak piece in his hands. He said, "You understand that we have been worried about you." She said, "I know you have." He said, "The cabin had no wood on the outside." She said, "The cabin has no wood on the outside because the wood is not on the outside. I specifically chose not to store wood outside because outside wood in Wisconsin Territory runs between 28 and 40% moisture by February, and wood at 35% moisture burns at roughly 60% efficiency compared to wood at 12% moisture. The difference over 5 months of winter for my stove and my cabin is approximately 3 additional cords consumed for the same heat output." He put the oak piece back in the stack. He said, 3 cords. She said, 3 cords. If I stored 14 cords outside in the standard way, I would effectively have approximately 11 cords of heating capacity by February. Stored in here, 14 cords is 14 cords in January, in February, and in March. The moisture stays below 15%. Halvard was quiet. She said, "I am not in crisis." I am in better condition than any other household in this settlement with respect to the winter wood situation. I'm sorry that the outside appearance of the cabin caused concern. He said, you could have told the settlement. She said, I tried to describe it to Ragnar Viken at the spring sewing circle. She thought I was describing my grief. He looked at her. She said, I was telling her what I planned to build, and she heard a widow woman in the first weeks after her husband's death describing an unusual construction project, and she concluded, generously, that I was working through the loss by talking about large projects. She was kind about it. She did not believe me. He said, because it sounded large. She said, because it sounded large, and because I was a widow in April, and widows in April do not usually describe 14-cord underground firewood chambers that they plan to build by June. Lars said, but you built it. She said, I built what I said I would build, yes. I said it to Ragnar and she was kind and did not believe it, and I went home and built it. This is the story of how Britta Sanvic, a 52-year-old Norwegian widow on a Wisconsin territory claim in the winter of 1849, spent the spring and summer after her husband's death building an underground firewood chamber connected to her cabin by a tunnel, and how the 14 cords of properly dried wood she stored in it before October kept her cabin at 54 degrees through the worst December the Beaver Dam settlement had recorded since its founding, and what the November woodcutting committee found when they came to assess the situation of a widow they had been worrying about since April. Britta had been born in Hardanger in western Norway, in the fjord country where the winters were long and wet, and the relationship between firewood and survival was one that every farm family understood intimately and sometimes desperately. Her father had been a farmer and a part-time boat builder, and the boat builder's understanding of wood had shaped how she thought about it, the specific intelligence of wood as a material that had properties and responded to conditions and could be managed correctly or incorrectly, and the management was the difference between a boat that held together and one that did not. She had understood from her father that wet wood in a boat builder's context was a catastrophe. Planks that had absorbed moisture were planks that had changed their dimensions, and planks that had changed their dimensions were planks that did not fit their joints, and planks that did not fit their joints were planks that allowed water in. The entire logic of boat building was the logic of managing wood moisture, keeping dry what needed to be dry, and shaping wet what needed to be shaped, and understanding the difference between the two states and the transitions between them. She had arrived in Wisconsin Territory in 1832 with Einar, who was a farmer and a practical man, and they had built the Beaver Dam claim from the creek bottom timber and the prairie soil, and the particular combination of Norwegian stubbornness and Wisconsin humidity that characterized the settlement's first decade. Einar had built the cabin. She had helped. Together they had built the root cellar, the animal barn, the smokehouse and the outhouse, all the structures that a claim required to function. The firewood storage had never been a building. It had been a south wall lean-to, standard for the settlement, and the wood stored in it had been the standard settlement wood, cut in autumn, stacked in October, burned through winter at the rate that wet October wood required. She had known since the second winter that the lean-to wood was wet. She had known it the way her father had known wet wood, by the feel and the weight and the way it burned, the hiss and the low flame, and the excessive smoke of combustion fighting moisture rather than combusting cleanly. She had mentioned it to Einar, and he had agreed that it would be better to have drier wood, and had not found the time or the particular urgency to do anything about it, which was the way that Einar managed most of the cabin's inefficiencies, with agreement and with postponement, because the farm was large and there was always something more immediately requiring attention. She had thought about what drier storage would look like for 17 years, from the second winter until the spring after Einar died. She had not built it while Einar was alive, because she had not built things without Einar's agreement, and Einar's agreement on large construction projects was slow in coming, and because the lean-to wood was wet but functional, and functional was the standard to which most things on the claim were managed. When Einar died in March, she lost the person whose agreement she had been waiting for. She also lost, in the same moment, the person whose labor she had been depending on for the cutting and hauling and splitting that the annual wood supply required. Einar had done most of the heavy cutting. She had split and hauled and stacked. Without Einar, the labor allocation that had been producing adequate wood for 17 years was gone, and she needed a different approach. The different approach she designed was not the one she would have designed if she had been working it out academically, with all options available. It was the one she arrived at through the specific conditions of her situation. She was alone. She had a hillside behind the cabin. She had 17 years of thinking about proper wood storage without ever having built it. And she had the grief that pushed practical people toward building things as a way of going somewhere other than where the grief was. She went to the hillside on the first week of April, 5 days after the burial, with the household thermometer and a long-handled spade. She had been looking at that hillside for 17 years. It was the south-facing slope of the low ridge behind the cabin, 20 feet of gradual rise from the cabin's back wall to the ridgeline, protected from the north wind by the ridge itself, exposed to the southern sun. In summer, the hillside was warm. In winter, it was the warmest piece of ground on the claim. She had stored root vegetables in a shallow coal pit at its base for 12 years and had noted, each spring when she opened the coal pit, that the temperature inside had stayed near the temperature she wanted rather than following the outside air temperature. She pushed the thermometer into the hillside at 4 feet depth and waited 10 minutes and read it. 53 degrees. She pushed it in again at 5 feet. 54 degrees. She moved 20 feet further up the slope and pushed it in at 4 feet, 52 degrees. She moved back to her starting position and this time pushed the thermometer in at 6 feet, 54 degrees. The temperature at depth was consistent, 52 to 54 degrees across the variations of position and depth she had tested. This was the earth temperature, the temperature of the ground at the depth where the surface variation could not reach, where the winter cold could not penetrate, and the summer heat could not either. The earth at 4 feet in Wisconsin territory was 52 to 54 degrees in April and would be 52 to 54 degrees in January. She sat on the hillside with the thermometer in her hand and looked at the cabin below her and thought about what 14 cords of firewood stored at 52 degrees would be like in February. In February, wood stored at 52 degrees would be exactly what it had been in September. Properly dried, stable, at the moisture content it had reached through the summer drying rather than the elevated moisture content that outdoor wood accumulated through the winter freeze-thaw. It would be the same wood, the same moisture, the same efficiency. She did the arithmetic. 14 cords of dried wood, maintained at 15% moisture or below through the chamber's stable temperature, burning at approximately 22 million BTU per cord. Her stove's heat requirement through a Wisconsin winter for the cabin volume and the insulation values she knew from 17 years of records, approximately 160 million BTU total. At 22 million per cord, 7 1/4 cords, she had space for 14 cords. She needed 7 1/4. The surplus was the insurance. The surplus was the cords she would have available if the winter was longer than expected, or if the cutting went poorly, or if her son Niels needed wood on his adjacent claim, or if something happened that she could not predict in April, but that January sometimes produced. The surplus was also the proof. 7 cords was what she needed. 14 was what would demonstrate to the settlement when they came to look at the situation that the construction had been worth the labor, that the design was not a mourning project, but a legitimate structural improvement that produced results that the November survey would find impossible to argue with. She built the chamber from April through June. The excavation was the first and largest work. She dug from the point she had selected at the base of the hillside, 8 feet back from the cabin's rear wall, cutting into the slope at a gradual angle that preserved the hillside's natural drainage above the chamber, while creating the connection passage that would eventually reach the cabin's rear foundation. She used the long-handled spade for the initial excavation, and the mattock for the clay hardpan she encountered at 2.5 feet, which was harder than the topsoil above it and required the mattock's impact rather than the spade's pressure. The excavation work was 2 hours each morning before the farm work and 2 hours each evening after, a pace that she held through April because the farm work of April was unavoidable and the tunnel was additive to the day rather than replacing anything. She was alone, which meant the excavated material had to be hauled out by herself in the canvas sack, each load requiring a trip out of the growing passage and up to the surface, where she spread the material in the depression behind the root cellar, filling the low spot that had collected water every spring for 12 years. She was making the tunnel by removing material that improved a drainage problem on the surface, a coincidence that she noted as evidence that the right work in the right place sometimes solved more than one problem. The chamber dimensions she had settled on in the last days of March, lying awake in the cabin with the new quiet of a house with one person in it, thinking through the volume she needed and the structural requirements and what the space needed to feel like for her to use it comfortably through a winter. She was 52 years old, and she was not a young woman, and she was going to be in this space in January carrying armloads of wood, and the space needed to be practical for a 52-year-old woman alone. 8 feet wide, 20 feet deep, 7 feet ceiling height at the rear wall, tapering to 6 feet at the front, where the tunnel connection came in. The ceiling lower at the front because that was the connection point, and a lower connection point meant the tunnel exit into the chamber was below the main floor level of the chamber, which created the thermal differential that kept cold air from flowing back through the tunnel into the cabin when the hatch was open. She had thought about this carefully. A tunnel from the cabin floor into a wood storage chamber was only useful as a thermal barrier if the chamber temperature was lower than the cabin temperature. At 52 degrees, the chamber would always be lower than the heated cabin, which would be 55 to 65 degrees depending on the stove and the season. When she opened the hatch to get wood, she would be opening a passage from warm air at 60 degrees above to cool air at 52 below, and the warm cabin air would stay in the cabin because warm air rose, and the chamber air would stay in the chamber because cool air sank. Unlike a conventional doorway, which opened at floor level and admitted cold air at the floor level where it pooled and chilled, the tunnel hatch opened above the chamber air, and the air exchange worked in the right direction. A small amount of warm cabin air descended into the chamber on each opening, which marginally raised the chamber temperature and was immediately corrected by the chamber's thermal mass, while the cooler chamber air stayed in the chamber rather than pouring into the cabin. This was the same principle as Mina Schreiber's cold air trap, though Britta had never met Mina Schreiber and arrived at the same physics from her father's boat-building logic about why materials behaved the way they behaved in conditions. The material, whether air or water or wood, went where its density took it. And if you built the structure with density in mind, the material did the work you needed without additional management. She built the chamber walls as she excavated, fitting limestone pieces from the creek bed against the cut earth faces, no mortar, dry stone fitting in the traditional Norwegian style, each piece selected for the contact surface it made, with the pieces above and below, the wall stable not because it was glued, but because the stone geometry made collapse unlikely. She had seen dry stone walls in Norway that were 300 years old and still standing, and understood that the absence of mortar was not a deficiency, but a design choice that allowed the wall to flex with seasonal ground movement rather than cracking. The floor she prepared with care, 6 inches of creek gravel over packed clay, raked level and tamped by the back of the spade until the surface was firm and did not give under foot pressure. The gravel layer served 2 functions: drainage, allowing any moisture that seeped through the chamber walls or condensed from the wood's drying process to percolate downward rather than pooling at the surface, and insulation between the wood stack bases and the ground moisture that the clay below would always carry. The wood that sat on wet ground became wet wood, regardless of how dry it had been when it was placed. This was the fundamental error of the standard outdoor lean-to storage, where the bottom course of the wood pile sat on earth or gravel that was always cycling its moisture. She had watched this for 17 years, had watched the bottom courses of the lean-to wood come out in February wetter than the courses above them, and had understood that the ground was doing what the ground did. The gravel floor broke the capillary connection between the ground moisture and the wood base. The gravel layer held no moisture in the capillary sense. It allowed moisture to pass through it downward, but did not hold it in contact with the wood above. The bottom courses of the wood stack, sitting on the gravel, sat on an air-permeable barrier rather than a moisture-transmitting surface. She stacked the first wood on July 8th. Niels came the second week of August, her son from the adjacent claim, 23 years old, strong and willing, and she put him to work cutting the standing timber she had marked in June, the mature ash and hickory in the creek bottom that she had identified as the right wood for the chamber, the species that dried well and burned hot and were available in the quantity she needed within a reasonable hauling distance from the tunnel entrance. She did not tell Niels about the chamber until he arrived and saw it. He arrived, climbed down from his horse, looked at the cabin, looked at the absence of any wood pile outside, looked at her and said, "Where is the wood?" She said, "Come." She showed him the hatch. He went down through the tunnel and stood in the chamber with the lantern and looked at the 6 cords of ash she had stacked in July and said, "You built this." She said, "Yes." He said, "In the spring." She said, "April through June." He said, "Alone." She said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "How?" She said, "With the spade and the mattock and the limestone from the creek. The structural method is Norwegian dry stone. The drainage layer is creek gravel. The ventilation is the same principle as a cave draft. The temperature differential between the deeper part and the entrance keeps the air moving." He said, "You planned this." She said, "In the winter. I planned it for years, actually. Your father and I disagreed about it. He agreed it was a good idea, and he found other things to do. He looked at the stacked walls of ash. He said, 'You needed 14 cords.' She said, 'I needed 7.5 for the winter. I built the chamber for 14 because the cutting season was available, and I had the capacity, and the 14 was not significantly more work than the 7.5 once the chamber was built. The space was already there.' He said, 'You wanted the surplus.' She said, 'I wanted proof.' He looked at her. He said, 'Proof of what?' She said, 'That this was not grief, that this was what I said it was.' He was quiet. She said, 'I told Ragnar Viken in April what I was planning, and she thought I was managing the loss through large plans. She was kind about it. She was wrong, but I understood why she thought it. A widow in April making 14-cord storage plans. She heard something that was not what I was saying.' He said, 'What were you saying?' She said, 'I was saying that I had spent 17 years watching wet wood burn at 60% efficiency, and now I had the time and the reason and the hillside, and I was going to build what should have been built in 1834 and was not.' He picked up an ash piece from the July stack and held it in his hands. It was light. The split face was pale and uniform, the thumbnail impression showing no expressed moisture. the weight of a piece that had been drying at 52 degrees for 6 weeks in a chamber with adequate airflow. He said, "This wood is better than anything we had last February." She said, "Yes," he said, 2 months in the chamber is better than 7 months outside." She said, "The chamber doesn't freeze the wood. The freezing is what drives moisture back in. Outdoor wood gets wet in the rain, partially dries, freezes, thaws, gets wet again. By February, it has cycled a dozen times, and each cycle drives moisture deeper into the wood fiber. The chamber wood dries once in July and then maintains." He said, "What should I tell the settlement?" She said, "Nothing yet. Cut the next 8 cords with me first. After that you can tell anyone who asks." They cut 8 cords in 2 weeks. Niels was faster than she had been alone, and with 2 people on the crosscut, saw the cutting went at nearly twice the pace she had maintained through July. The 8 cords went into the chamber by the end of August, and she finished the stacking alone in September, when Niels went back to his own claim. 14 cords in the chamber by October 1st. The chamber temperature, 52 degrees. The wood moisture, tested by thumbnail and by the weight of individual pieces compared to their freshly cut counterparts. Below 15% on the oldest stack, below 20% on the most recent. She closed the hatch, laid the braided rag rug over it, and waited for November. The November woodcutting committee came on the 2nd Wednesday and found what she had planned for them to find, which was no wood outside and 62 degrees inside and 14 cords below the floor rug, and a widow woman who had spent April through September building what she had said she was going to build. Halvard Viken stood in the chamber with the lantern and touched the dry ash and looked at Petter's ledger entry and said, 14 cords, well dried. She said, "Yes." He said, "The survey entry will show this as the best prepared household in the Western Circuit." She said, "I have more wood than I need for the winter. The surplus is available to any family in the settlement that runs short. I will not give it as charity. I will exchange it for labor in the spring, specifically for help expanding the chamber by 12 feet, which will bring it to 32 feet depth and allow 18 cords next autumn." Halvard said, "You want to expand it." She said, "I want to store enough wood that running short is not a possibility I need to manage. The current capacity is adequate. 18 cords would give me substantial reserves for years when the cutting goes poorly." Petterstrand looked up from the ledger. He said, "You are already planning next year." She said, "I have been planning since April. Planning is what I do when the farm work is done and the evenings are long." Lars Husum had not said much since they had come into the chamber. He had been standing near the back wall, touching the oldest stacked wood, and looking at the limestone facing and the gravel floor and the ventilation gap at the upper rear corner, which was a 4-inch square opening fitted with a sliding cover that Britta kept open by 2 inches in the summer and closed by 3/4 in the winter. He said, "The ventilation gap," she said, "keeps the air moving through the chamber. Without it, the moisture from the drying wood would accumulate in the chamber air and slow the drying. With it, the warmer, moist air from the wood rises and escapes through the gap at the top, and drier air enters through the tunnel connection at the bottom. The same principle as a cave draft." He said, "You studied this." She said, "I observed it. I went into a limestone cave on the north end of the ridge in April and felt the air movement and understood from my father's explanation of ventilation in the boat sheds what was happening. The cave was already doing what I needed the chamber to do. I built the chamber to reproduce the cave's conditions in a location closer to the cabin." He said, "Your father built boat sheds." She said, "He built boats." The shed ventilation was required to keep the wood stock dry, because a boat builder's wood that absorbed moisture was a boat builder's wood that changed its dimensions, and changed dimensions in boat plank was a boat that leaked. He understood wood moisture the way a doctor understands fever. He said, "And you understood it from him." She said, I understood what he showed me, and I applied it to a different problem in a different place, which is the only way any knowledge moves. The three men ate the coffee cake she had made that afternoon, sitting around the table in the warm cabin, and Halvard made the notes in the survey ledger that the November assessment required, and Lars asked 3 more questions about the construction, and Petter calculated the heating efficiency improvement from the wood's reduced moisture and wrote the number in the margin of his notes. The number Petter calculated was 41%. 41% more usable heat energy per cord of wood stored in the chamber versus wood stored in the outdoor lean-to, based on the moisture differential between 15% and 35%. She said, reading his calculation, "That is my number as well. I arrived at it differently from the stove consumption records, but the same result." He said, "You have stove consumption records." She said, "Einar kept them from the second winter. I have continued them. 16 years of records showing wood consumed per month and the temperature maintained. The comparison between the records for periods when the stove wood was fresher in October and November and when it was wettest in February and March shows the efficiency drop across the winter. The chamber removes that drop entirely." He looked at 16 years of records. He said, "You have been planning this since the second winter." She said, "I have been thinking about it since the second winter. Planning requires the ability to act. I was not in a position to act until this spring." He said, "Because Einar disagreed." She said, "Because Einar was not ready to build it and I was not willing to build it against his wishes." He did not disagree exactly. He agreed it was a good idea. He was not ready. He said, "And now?" She said, "Now I am the only person whose readiness is required." She said this plainly without bitterness, and Petter heard the plainness and did not push further into it, which was the appropriate response to a plain statement made by a woman who had spent the 7 months since her husband's death converting her readiness into 14 cords of dry firewood in a chamber under the cabin floor. The settlement's reaction to the woodcutting committee's report was the reaction of a community that had been worried about the Sanvic widow, and had found that their worry had been unnecessary, which was a combination of relief and the slight deflation that came from having worried correctly at the level of situation and incorrectly at the level of the specific woman they were worrying about. Ragnar Viken came to see the chamber the following Saturday, alone, and stood in it for a long time with the lantern. She said, "I thought you were talking about plans as a way of processing the loss." Britta said, "I was, and the plans were real." Ragnar said, "Both at once." Britta said, "People do not stop being practical when they grieve. They sometimes become more practical because the grief removes the reasons to wait." Ragnar said, "Einar's agreement." Britta said, "Einar's agreement, and the sense that the plans were for the 2 of us and alone they were for just me, which made them feel different. In April, they became mine, and mine was enough reason." Ragnar picked up a piece of ash from the October stack. She said, "It is lighter than any wood I have picked up in February." Britta said, "Because it has not cycled, one drying in July and then storage at stable temperature. The wood you pick up in February from your lean-to has been wet and frozen and thawed and wet again, and it is heavier than it was in October, because it has absorbed the moisture of 6 freeze-thaw cycles." Ragnar said, "And this has not." Britta said, "This has not." Ragnar set the ash piece back carefully. She said, "My claim is on flat ground. I have no hillside." Britta said, "A flat ground chamber is more excavation but the same result. You dig down rather than in. The tunnel connection goes down from the cabin floor rather than angling through a hillside. More work, same performance." Ragnar said, "Would you help me design it?" Britta said, "In the spring. Come in April and we will look at your site, and I will tell you what I see." Ragnar said, "You will want something in exchange." Britta said, "I want to expand this chamber by 12 feet in the spring. I need 3 additional weeks of help carrying limestone from the creek for the wall facing. If you can give me that, I can give you the design work for your chamber." Ragnar said, 3 weeks for a chamber design." Britta said, 3 weeks for a chamber design and 16 years of stove consumption records and every measurement and material specification I used in this one, documented in a form you can hand to whoever does your excavation work." Ragnar said, "You have already written the documentation." Britta said, "I wrote it in the evenings through September, after the chamber was complete. I did not know yet who I was writing it for. Now I know it is for you first." She had written it in the household ledger, in the back pages that Einar had left blank, his neat handwriting ending in February and her own continuing from April in a slightly different hand that was not trying to match his, but was writing what needed to be written in the pages where it fit. The documentation covered 41 pages, from the site selection criteria to the excavation sequence, to the limestone wall construction, to the gravel floor, preparation to the ventilation gap, sizing to the hatch construction, to the wood stacking pattern that she had arrived at over the summer. The stacking pattern had been a discovery in itself. She had begun stacking the July wood in the standard parallel alternating pattern, each course laid perpendicular to the course below it, and had found by August that the standard pattern left less airflow between the pieces than she wanted for the initial drying phase. She had restacked the July wood in a modified pattern that left a consistent 1-inch air gap between each piece in the same course, in addition to the cross-stack pattern between courses, and had found that the restacked wood dried faster in the following weeks than the originally stacked wood in the adjacent section of the chamber. She had documented this carefully because it was the kind of discovery that was specific to the chamber conditions, and that anyone building a similar chamber would benefit from knowing in advance rather than arriving at by experience. The documentation included a section on what went wrong, because she had read enough German farming manuals through the settlement's shared library to know that the section on what went wrong was the section that was most useful in practice and least often included. What had gone wrong in the Sanvic chamber during the construction? The first ventilation gap placement had been on the south wall, rather than the rear wall. She had made this choice in April, based on intuition about airflow direction, and had found in June that the placement created an air circulation pattern that did not reach the deepest section of the chamber, leaving the rear 5 feet of the chamber with inadequate airflow and a wood drying rate that lagged the front sections. She had cut the gap in the rear wall in July and sealed the south wall placement, and the airflow had corrected within 2 weeks. The first tunnel connection angle had been too steep, 10 degrees rather than the 4 degrees she arrived at finally. The steep angle made the tunnel floor slippery in wet weather and had produced in 2 trials a situation where she had stumbled descending into the chamber and had dropped an armload of wood in the tunnel passage. She had regraded the tunnel floor in June to the shallower angle, and the access became comfortable. The original hatch dimensions had been based on what she had estimated she would be able to carry through them, which was an armload of 6 to 8 pieces, which required a hatch opening of approximately 24 by 36 inches. She had built it at those dimensions and had found in July that the hatch also needed to accommodate the moments when she was in a hurry and needed to move quickly from the cabin to the chamber, which required the hatch to be large enough for a person to descend without angling sideways. She had rebuilt the hatch at 36 by 48 inches, which was larger than she had originally planned and required more structural reinforcement of the surrounding floor section, but produced an access that she could use efficiently. These were the things that had gone wrong and how she had addressed them. She included them, because anyone building from her documentation would encounter the same problems and would benefit from knowing that the problems had solutions and what the solutions were. She gave Ragnar the documentation in April and walked Ragnar's flat ground site in the second week of April and produced a modified design for a flat ground chamber that substituted a vertical descent for the hillside angle, with a 5-foot deep primary chamber connected to a 12-foot lateral storage extension at the bottom, the whole structure accessible through a hatch in the cabin floor and a near vertical ladder descent rather than the tunnel slope of the hillside design. The Viken flat ground chamber, built that summer with Halvard's considerable physical contribution and the detailed documentation Britta provided, was operational by October and stored 11 cords of wood through its first winter, demonstrating a temperature of 50 degrees in the January survey and wood moisture of 16% in February, when Halvard checked it with his thumbnail. He said to Britta at the February sewing circle that the February wood felt different from any February wood he had held in 23 years of Wisconsin winters. She said, "It is drier than the outside wood because the chamber does not cycle it." He said, "I have not said anything about the tunnel in April. I am saying it now. The tunnel was the right idea." She said, "Yes." He said, "You knew it was the right idea in April." She said, "I have known it since the second winter. I was waiting for Einar and then I stopped waiting." He said, "Why did you stop waiting?" She said, "Einar was ready to agree and not ready to build. I needed the building." He said, "The building was the grieving." She said, "The building was the building. The grieving was separate and concurrent. People confuse them because both happen at the same time, but they are not the same." He said, "The tunnel was not about Einar." She said, "The tunnel was about 17 winters of wet wood, and one spring when I no longer had to wait for the right time." He said, "And the right time was the wrong time by every measure." She said, "The right time is always the wrong time by the measures that look at the circumstances. It was spring and I was alone, and I was grieving and I had no help, and it was the first spring in 17 years when I could build without asking anyone. By the circumstantial measures, entirely the wrong time. By the practical measures, the right time." He was quiet. He said, "The expanded chamber for this autumn." She said, "I will need 3 weeks of labor in June." He said, "I will bring 2 men." She said, 2 men for 2 weeks is better than 1 woman for 3. He said, 2 men for 2 weeks then. The chamber expansion happened in June of 1850, extending the rear wall by 12 feet and widening the rear section from 8 feet to 10, bringing the total storage capacity to 18 cords. The ventilation was extended with a second gap in the rear wall section, sized and positioned to serve the expanded volume on the same airflow principles as the original gap. Niels came for 2 weeks in August, and they cut the 18 cords together, and the chamber was full by September 15th, which was 2 weeks earlier than the previous year, and which gave the September and October airflow more time to work on the most recently stacked wood before the chamber temperature began its slow decline toward the 50-degree winter baseline. Halvard came in November for the annual survey and wrote 18 cords in the Sanvic ledger entry and said, "The best prepared household in the settlement." She said, "I expect that will be true every year from now on." He said, "For as long as there is a chamber to store in." She said, "For as long as the chamber stands, which will be longer than either of us." He said, "You built it to last." She said, "I built it from limestone, and I built the walls with Norwegian dry stone method, and I built the floor from creek gravel over packed clay, and I built the hatch from the best oak Einar had in his lumber supply. I built it to last because I built it once and did not want to build it again." He said, "Einar's oak." She said, "The best pieces." He had been saving them for the furniture he was planning. He said, "Do you mind?" She said, "That the oak is in the hatch rather than in the furniture. No, The hatch is something he would have built if he had built the chamber. The chamber is what I built. The furniture was a different project and a different time, and neither the project nor the time arrived. He said, "The hatch is good work." She said, "Yes, it is good work." I made it carefully because he had kept the oak carefully, and the oak deserved to be made into something good. The Sanvic tunnel chamber operated continuously through Britta's tenure on the claim, which lasted until 1867, when her son Niels took over the farm, and she moved to his house on the adjacent claim to spend her last years near her grandchildren. She left the documentation in the household ledger on the shelf beside the stove, with a note to Niels that the ledger and the chamber were to be maintained together, because the ledger was the explanation of the chamber, and the chamber was the practice of the ledger, and neither was fully useful without the other. Niels kept both. He kept the wood consumption records in the format she had established, noting the cubic footage and the estimated moisture and the monthly consumption, and by 1875 the ledger had 26 years of records across 2 hands, Einar's stopping in February 1849, and Britta's continuing from April, and Niels's continuing from 1867. The family that bought the claim in 1884, after Niels moved to Milwaukee, read the ledger and understood the chamber and maintained it. The second family that bought it in 1901 did the same. In 1931, a great drought year when the Wisconsin weather cooperated in ways it did not always cooperate, the chamber failed for the first time. A section of the rear wall facing collapsed under the weight of a wet spring, and the limestone facing had to be rebuilt. The cost of the repair was 4 days of work and 60 limestone pieces from the creek. The family who made the repair found, when they dug out the collapsed section, that the foundation courses of the original wall were still perfectly set. The limestone pieces fitted with the Norwegian dry stone precision that Britta had brought from Hardanger in 1832 and applied to a Wisconsin hillside in the spring and summer after her husband died. 82 years of winters. The foundation courses had not moved. They rebuilt the upper courses in the same style and sealed the gap in the wall facing and restacked the wood, and the chamber was operational again by July. The foreman who directed the repair wrote in his work diary, "Whoever built the foundation of this wall knew what they were doing. The base courses are better set than anything I have built." He did not know who had built the foundation or when, or what had been happening in her life when she built it. He knew the base courses were well set. They were. She had built them carefully in April 1849, 5 weeks after burying her husband, pressing each limestone piece into contact with the pieces above and below and beside it, selecting for the contact surface and the fit, the boat builder's understanding of how materials held together when they were correctly shaped to each other. She had built the base courses carefully because the base courses were the foundation of everything above them, and because the careful work was what she had to give to the problem at the time, and she gave it fully. Earth holds, stone holds, dry wood burns true. She had built all 3. If this story changed how you think about the knowledge that grief and practical intelligence can produce together, and what it means to stop waiting for the right time and build what the wrong time actually allows, hit that like button now and subscribe to this channel. Drop a comment below telling me where you are watching from. And I want to know this. Have you ever built something important during a time in your life when most people would have said you should have been resting? That is Britta Sanvic's story, and it is every practical person's answer to loss. Leave your answer below. I read every single comment. The Sanvic tunnel chamber stands today, filled with the modern-era concrete that a 1952 renovation poured into it when the claim's 20th-century owners decided the hatch was a safety hazard for children. Before it was filled, someone pressed a thermometer into the chamber floor at 4 feet depth. 53 degrees, June 1952. The same temperature Britta had measured in April 1849 when she sat on the hillside and thought about what 14 cords of wood stored at 52 degrees would be like in February. The earth had held it for 103 years. It would have held it longer if they had let it.